first of all, for those of you who may not know me, my name is Dave Westwood. I am Director of Consultancy for Fuse Universal. For those of you who may be coming through a Fuse webinar for the first time or may not know entirely about us, we are an organization that produces an integrated learning platform which we support the likes of Vodafone, Scandic Hotels, Hilti and Carpetright, all use our platform in order to create measurable business results by delivering learning, skills development and performance coaching to their employees and partners through this consumer grade technology that we provide. So should you want any more information around Fuse, the work that we do or anything else, then please do head to the website after this webinar and you'll be able to access demo material and access a lot more understanding about us. So throughout the webinar today, we will be, as I say, utilizing the chat functionality in order to be able to access any questions. So if we just pop onto the next slide, please, Imogen. Thank you very much. So yes, please do use the Q&A box at any point. Make sure that you have, if you haven't already, put to all panelists and attendees, and therefore we'll all be able to see any questions you have. It's my very great pleasure to be able to introduce the gentleman who's going to be hosting us today. So Craig is an industry analyst and CEO of findandlms.com, if he does need any introduction. He was one of the early pioneers in the e-learning space, been involved in the space since 1999. Not that we're going to give any idea to Craig's age away at all. He provides analyst, advisory and consultancy services to vendors in the e-learning industry and to those individuals who are looking to understand the future of the technology space within learning and development and trends for learning and development going forward. So with that in mind, I will hand over directly to Craig now and say thank you very much again for being with us today, sir, and very much excited about what you're going to be talking to us about.
Well, excuse me for that. Thank you. Can we go back previous slide there? Thank you. Nope, we're going. Okay. So anyway, my name is Craig Weiss. I want to thank you all very much from all over the world for attending today's session, which is going to be dealing with L&D trends for 2020. I saw different people's weather updates. I'm here in Los Angeles, where it is partly cloudy and probably for us very cold in the low 50s. So we're going to cover, I think, today 5 trends that I'm seeing that will happen in 2020. And we'll go ahead and start next with our first slide. So number one here I see is coaching. And coaching can also be, perhaps you might use the term mentoring. They're sort of one and the same, I consider that way. And, you know, coaching, I think, changes a lot of the parameters on what people perceive. And in this case, because we're doing all kind of remote work, that a coach in a twofold. One is that it becomes much more interactive. And majority of systems, I would say probably the ones that have coaching, 90%, is where the employee, it's typically employees. I haven't seen really B2B or customer training leverage the form of coaching in a system. But what it tends to be is you have the employee on the other side and they either record themselves in some fashion, a webcam or a mobile device. And then what they do is they send that to the coach. And the coach could be a manager, tends to be a manager. That's not my recommendation. I think it needs to be people just like them. And they send it over to the manager or, you know, the head of sales training, if it's sales training. And then what happens is the person on the other side looks at that video and sends back their response in text. This is very reactive. There's no interactivity going on there. And so what it should be, and I think there are a couple of systems starting to do this, is where the coach, the manager, whomever it is on the other side, actually records themselves, and then the person sees it, and then it kind of goes back to back and forth in that regard. Is it fully proactive? The answer is likely not. But interactivity has to play a big role, and I believe it will with coaching. I think you'll see some that will add some level of scenarios. They may go and utilize, a solution I saw the other day, which kind of has this thing where they can do voice analysis. So it has to be more interactive. It's going to have to include some levels of scenarios, real world, real life, not like you're sitting in an academic, textbook. And, the big challenge for coaching has always been, and I can count the number of vendors who have an app with coaching functionality on it. I can count on one hand with that. I believe you're going to see an increase with mobile for coaching. That's going to have some additional components. It's somewhat of a challenge because there's one vendor that's trying to have live coaches, which can be understandable, but it's not really doable in a remote setting like that exists during nowadays pandemic. But I think it is doable, and some vendors will move on that route as they try to offer more and more functionality with their mobile apps to offset some of the challenges that take place here with coaching. So one of the things I do see here, which I didn't know, is I think you'll see some systems have sort of coaching experts, if you will, and put them together in like a small group, and you can go ahead and select these people, and they have an experience with a coaching level. This is what coaching platforms do. So I do believe that you'll see that in other types of systems as they go forward. Next slide, please. So here we come down to what's happening in the learning system space. And the challenge is, what's better as a coach, a human being or a chatbot? And that's what they typically tend to be. And so if you look at what the bots are, they're more kind of geared towards, I always refer to them as how I can assist you, right? How can I answer your questions? And I have to wonder if that's really the best serve, through that. So the learner goes ahead and submits a question, then the bot responds. I think anybody who's ever had an experience on a website that uses a chatbot, it's easy to become very frustrated because you have to phrase the questions in such a way that the bot understands it. And so what some vendors are saying is, look, as the bot learns more and more, it can be more effective, in that. And again, you have to be very specific. It's sort of like if you think you went into a search engine, if you just type in a word coaching, you're going to get all these kind of results. If you type in coaching with parentheses and hit a plus sign and whatever you're wanting to look at and put quotations around them, you're going to get more specific and detailed responses or search results than if you just did ambiguity. And I think that, the bots, again, this is all about a reactive, it's text, right? So it's constantly reactive, and it all depends on how the vendor, whether they got a bot from somewhere else and they're just plugging it in, or whether they designed it themselves. And to me, it's just an ineffective method. It's something to add, give some people some wows and oohs, but it's not really very effective. It's not effective in terms of providing, a level that people expect. It's definitely not effective as a coach or an expert on there. Again, the strength is on a human being. They have to be an expert in a specific field or fields. And part of the challenge with coaching online is that, again, most companies, and it will take place remotely here, perceive the manager is the expert, but the manager may not be the expert in what you're doing. They may have a completely different role. For example, if you're looking at human resources, the head of human resources isn't going to be a person that's an expert in every field in HR. It's just not possible. So if you're trying to have a coach in HRIS, it's highly unlikely that the person that's running HR is an expert in HRIS. They're going to be an expert in a variety of other things. So this is where you get a mistake, I believe, happening. And I think that you're going to have the opportunity to have people that are much more level of experts or seasoned experts, whether that's you bring in somebody that's third party or that it's somebody within, you know, your company. If you're a person in retail, for example, managerial level, and you need to have sort of these, you know, pieces that go through to that, then that kind of has that person as a level of an expertise, and it could be a variety of different people. It has to be doable. Face-to-face is very doable. You can put, you know, a variety of different things that are in there, real-time web conferencing capabilities. They're all using, you know, third-party tools. They need to be able to be proactive in terms of listening and assisting and coaching. So, you know, a coach is, when you're doing, and I see this as a trend here, is especially with the remote workforce today, you can have a much more opportunities. I believe systems will leverage this into having much more coaching functionality than what they currently have today. And it's, again, it's driven by the market, but also driven by the challenges that the market faces. So there are a lot of vendors that rely on what their clients want. And in this case, if you're not used to leveraging a variety of coaching, then the system doesn't necessarily do that. So I believe that it will change and it will become much more of an interactive experience than what currently exists today. Next slide, please. So, you know, this is always a big question when you add coaching functionality or coaching in the L&D space. And again, you may be using a coaching platform. They do exist. And the big question is will end users follow, right? So if I have an expert on there, some people may call it ask an expert or something of this regard, you know, will the masses follow? You're always going to have some people that are just very active, and then you have a lot of people that aren't. And so, you know, first and foremost, the coach has to be able to understand what is taking place, right? So that's part of that expertise. They have to be able to be an expert in multiple pieces. If that person's asking a question dealing with, say, accounts payable, you'll need to have an expert that is experienced in accounting dealing with accounts payable. They have to be able to respond. And again, 90%, it's all text driven. So the response has to be a little bit different. I've seen one product where the coaches went about and they took, which I think is fantastic, is they assessed all these different recordings, and then they selected sort of like a top 10, and you went into the system. This was in the system. It had an area, and then other learners could see who was in the top 10, like at a rating scale. So they knew they were the best of the best. But what the system should have done is that they should have had it with the people that are actually the experts doing that kind of recording, right? That's how you sort of, you know, learn in there. And it's all about engagement. So I think the trend I see is that coaching will become more engaged. And again, when I've heard of coaching, it can also be a mentor. It can be an ask an expert. So some systems, the vernacular is not the same, but they're going to be more engaged. And this is a direct correlation to a remote workforce where you have some of that flexibility likely in time. Next slide, please. So here's the second trend, and this is skills management. And you're very likely already seeing this taking place. It's all about skills driven and skill focused, right? But part of the challenge is, I believe, is that we're relying too heavily on the job role. So the skills are just tied to the job role. And thus, you know, there are a lot of factors that come into the place. If Sarah's only job is to put a plug on a widget, and that's all they're going to be doing, then if you're skills driven, skills focused, you're just providing those skills for her to do maybe a more efficient job or a more effective role, you know, in there. And what I see is a continuation. I believe it's going to be heavily geared towards white collar workers, which is unfortunate. And that's the way the systems are gearing towards it. And it's also the way that I notice numerous companies are as well, is the as a whole, when it comes to skills management, it's very driven by the white collar professional workforce that the company has. If they have some blue collar workers, it's not geared to them. It's not structured for them. And so it's all about, the terms you're going to hear is onboarding, which is a consistent term, and all about upskilling. So if you have upskilling, you're going to be taking place on this kind of endeavor where they go forward with this. And this is, again, something that, when kind of going through this with the trend, was even an early trend that was taking place before the pandemic. So upskilling and onboarding has been a consistent trend. It's going to become much more so because, again, who's the target audience? And the downside to that is that I've never really met, you can be an expert in doing pick and pack in a warehouse. And you would think from skills management, I might have interest, in something else, right? So it's all about, when you look at like LXPs or some other NLMSs and other types of learning systems, they're now having maybe like you can pick topics of interest. But if you're having an upskill and you're doing pick and pack, but you are very interested in accounting, then as the organization, then you should give me those opportunities to do that. But that's not what is taking place. And so what I find with upskilling is, again, this whole kind of other structure goes through. You can be a great manager in a warehouse, and who says that you can't have an opportunity to be upskilled to, maybe if you have a desire to, again, go into sales or have a variety of different skill sets, right? Why should we be limited to one skill? And I believe that systems are going to sort of drive, I hope, some systems will drive where there's much more flexibility. And the big thing is, and this dealt with pre-pandemic, and it's definitely directly relating to pandemic. Think about all the people that have just lost their job because the offices, locations have been closed. Here in the United States, 2 million people last week filed for unemployment. And when you go into, when I initially identified this trend, I was talking about dealing with specific industries, oil and gas, mining, energy, right? Pre-pandemic, which is going to have a lot of people out of work. They don't have those skills to go in and do something else. So they need to be reskilled, right? They need to be given some way to do that. And if I don't have a computer at home, then I have to go to a location and all these other things. And in the past, it was often forgotten as related to that. Now we have, during the pandemic, all these people coming out of all these areas, businesses identified as non-essential. I mean, if you're at a restaurant or you're at a pub and you're only doing takeaway, which is what they use in the UK, or takeout, you don't need a staff of 50 people, right? You only need a couple of people. And so these people need to be reskilled to be given other opportunities. Now you say, well, Craig, you know what? They've been laid off. They're not going to have these kind of things. As a company, you can actually, as a business, you can say, if you're using a system, here, I'm going to give you access to still use the system. Here's an opportunity to be reskilled. So they learn new skills for that additional flexibility, because in reality, many of these businesses are never going to come back once the pandemic is over or subsides enough where people are going back into the workforce. It's just not going to happen. And it's also going to impact retail, which it already has, and all these other industries that are shuttered during this, and they have a lot of hourly or seasonal employees. So reskilling has to be in there. I believe that it will take place with some companies, but I don't think it will be extensive, which is really trends people always think are always positives and pluses, but this is a trend that I believe is a negative. And there's no indication that it's going to change over. Some people will do it, but I think that most people as a whole are just going to say, okay, goodbye, and move on. Next slide, please. So again, here's where it comes back into this of whether it's role-based or skill-based. And when I've talked to numerous individuals that run L&D and they're using a system or whatever kind of system, and there's skills management systems out there and skills platforms, again, it's all driven role-based. And yet you say to people, well, you have an opportunity to go into this department, right? So that's kind of one of the premises is that you have an employee in department X, they're interested in going to department Y, let's say it's product management and they're in sales, for example, or they're doing IT or whatever it might be, then they want to go into that. Or product management wants to go to business development, which I've seen before. They're not getting those skills for business development, right? They're getting those skills based on that job role. And the reality, and even plenty of L&D people say this, you know, we just think automatically that every company is going to say, okay, yeah, come on over. It doesn't work that way. I've seen territorial battles take place between two managers. I've seen companies that just don't, right, see that person going into that location. And this is why the dynamics have to change. It has to be skill-based and not role-based. And again, I think that out of all the learning systems, types of learning systems, by far the ones that have the best capability of doing that is either somebody that's just skills driven over and as a learning system, or the LXPs, to give people those kind of options where they have the skill based. And, you know, if you look at a vendor like Cornerstone, they're launching, or they will launch by the end of the year, Cornerstone Skills, which is, again, you can figure out skills management. And so that's an opportunity for the platform to go ahead and build, again, as we tie into remote working, where people are working at home. Skill-based is the most effective thing to do rather than role-based, because the roles are going to change. And now that's going to have to make that go about. And you have to change the thinking. You have to change the way that you're running business, the way you're training people or providing learning for them as a continuation. You know, you can make assigned learning till you're blue in the face. But what ends up happening with assigned learning, which you're giving them, again, skills based on a job role, is that that little algorithm that's taking place in machine learning, which I'll get to here shortly, is going to change, right? So their recommended or their topic of, you know, what's the most popular topics of interest is all going to be becoming more of the assigned learning, right? Because eventually there's going to be more of that than the other. And now you're just getting back into a role-based formula, which the more effective is skill-based. Next slide, please. Thank you. You know, there's the big talk about millennials. Now Gen Z is coming. Edge, I believe, is the one afterwards, which are like, you know, kids in high school. So, you know, Gen Z is this whole kind of approach where it's always like this, right? We had Gen X and Gen Y and millennial. I mean, there's plenty of millennials who are in their upper 30s. So, you know, there's things with the Gen Zs. When I've talked to numerous HR execs and, again, L&D people, what they tend to find, and this is on an average, right? It's not everybody, but they tend to find that they have a higher level of tech skills because they've been using of technology early on. But there's also some problems. They have very limited in terms of patience. They think everything should come to them without them kind of doing extensive. And they are really bad at handling criticism. So when you're dealing with coming up with a trend in terms of that, you know, and you look at and here we go with in terms of the role, how it can be to meet these, maximize these new skills. If I have an expertise in terms I'm very bad at handling criticism and you're providing some type of content for them, then leadership development isn't going to be of use to them. You have to target your direct audience. And I think that especially now with the pandemic, it's even more so to do that. The content has to be first and foremost interactive. A page clicker is a page clicker. A video that's 3 minutes is a video 3 minutes. There's nothing interactive about that. You might as well go back and put a VHS or a VCR and connect and go to. And it's funny because I just saw that in the consumer world, there's an uptick in VHS, which is strange. But you know, there's all those kind of consumer trends that take place, but you're back into the workforce. And this even is true with B2B and customer training, where they go, if you're doing product training, you have to change those dynamics that goes through there. And so again, these are topics that you could provide to employees while they're at home doing that. And there's plenty of content you can find that's at least somewhat engaging, rather than I'm looking at a click, as a point and click kind of thing that's going through there, and challenge that and change those things. So one trend I do see is that it's a cognizant fact, right? When I was talking to all these people, they all recognized it and they all saw the same things. So if you're seeing it, why are you not doing anything about it? And so I believe that one trend will be that there will be an opportunity, because it comes down to content, right? Content is a commodity, and yet there's a few thousand content providers out there. Most people tend to look at the vendor's marketplace to find the content, and then they sort of forget about their entire audience. They just look at a certain level of an audience or a certain kind of approach of the audience. And here is an opportunity to provide, because people access the content, they're accessing the system out of the workplace. So you go ahead and provide those things for them. And now it could eventually be they're going to have to do remote work. And there's so many people, even as adults, what am I saying? Even in their 40s and 50s and 60s, who have never done remote working. And so there will be people, in their 20s that would rather be watching a movie, and they're going to. So you have to provide enough content and stimulation to get them in there and leverage that kind of thing. And so that's a trend that I see taking place, is this split dynamic of certain companies. And I don't care what vertical or market that you're in or where you're located in the world, there's certain companies that are going to have to tap in and identify, we all focus on the strengths of people and we identify sort of some of their weaknesses. And that's how the content is kind of driven out. My belief is that you're going to find some people identify and say, you know what, it's not a weakness, it's just a mindset. And that mindset over a period of time can be trained to understand those differences and then replace them. Next slide, please. So trend number 3 is that instructor-led training impact. And I know a lot of people think I'm anti-instructor-led training, and you know what? I am. So I'm going to readily admit it. And perhaps that's because I started early in e-learning in the late 90s. And I did work, when I ran training at a bunch of companies, there were plenty of people that, we had to do a blended learning approach, but my personal belief is e-learning can do the same as ILT, and if not better. But it comes down to how the content's built, right? So you got to have engaging and interactive and all those other kinds of things. But one of the challenges, and here's the ILT impact. No one's going to be doing instructor-led training. Nobody's going to be doing face-to-face instructor-led training during the pandemic. It's not going to happen. So what's going to replace it? Well, here's one of the things we get into. This is going back to the coaching. That's a way that can be impacted, right? If you're doing a session and you think to yourself, hey, I can do it via video conferencing. I can have, we're going to do this thing about how to smile more, and I'm just going to allow all my company employees on there, all 500 or all 5,000, and this is going to be great. I can tell you right now, that's not going to work. The dynamics of communication doesn't change. It does change when you have thousands of people on there, because the thing is not all thousands of them are going to still be paying attention. It's not going to happen. So the topic does become relevant, but again, it has to relate to real world examples. And so here's where I think when you talk about coaching, on one side was the coaching. Digital coaching is going to be the big thing here. And again, it provides both more of a personal one-on-one experience, more so than the masses. And, when you look at product training and B2B customer training, it's one of the most successful type of markets available for online learning. And if you're charging people for instructor-led training, you can still do that through webinars. It can be very profitable, actually, if you go through that. And so I think that one of the trends that you're going to see, and it will happen with so many vendors, I don't think it's going to be a massive takeoff trend, because I think there's a lot of people that just can't wrap a head around that they have to modify their system going forward. So classroom management has always been tied to instructor-led training. So when you see that, that's what they're related to. But facilities is not going to be applicable anymore in the foreseeable future. So modifications are going to have to be made to classroom management at what type of level is not yet readily available. But I think event management ties into both webinars and seminars. I believe that they can take some of those pieces and put it in terms of changing the approach they have when it comes to classroom management. But when you're doing like we're doing here with a webinar right now, you can't see my face, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But what you need to have is this impact. There's just this big belief when it comes to instructor-led training that everybody's paying attention to the room. It's not true. Why do you think everybody sort of hangs back in a room towards the very back where they're eyeing the, walking out of the room if they can get away with it? So, you can put people in and have a little group, and they can put up a little, sheet, and they can go through to that. But with the digital coaching, you're really having that engaging experience, for that. And if you want to replace and you're like, look, we don't see digital coaching as an effective methodology, and we still believe in instructor-led training, then, then set up a series of online access. I don't like saying online classes, because that's synchronous based learning, and that's not effective. But having it where you have a calendar and you have certain sessions available for that week and give people some opportunity and times. Plus, the other nice thing is, just like what you're seeing here, is recording. Then I can go and view that recording at a later point. So everything kind of comes back to understanding that instructor-led training is gone for the time being. If you're doing effective e-learning, it can stay gone forever, and you can just type in and leverage webinars, which is going to be really taking off here in the coming time. And understand that in some cases, when the pandemic again subsides and people go back into the workplace, myself being a big e-learning fan, is the belief that you hopefully we'll see that e-learning can provide, if done right, the webinars gives people more of an opportunity. Next slide, please. So here comes the big one, right? COVID-19, what is the trend? This definitely is going to, obviously, everybody recognizes it's going to have an impact. When I was doing my L&D trends, initially I didn't have that because it was pre-pandemic. As it, expanded across the world. But then I kind of went in through and re-looked about it through there. And I know there's some people that are out there and they're going to say, oh, this is obvious and coming through, but I don't think necessarily. First and foremost, I think there's going to be more workforce tools out there. You're going to see more kind of things dealing with workbooks and just kind of what I put it into. And I'll talk in a second about what guided learning is. And, practice labs and putting notes about. So you're engaging the employee much more than just sort of, I'm going to throw out some stuff here. There's no reason that you need to put compliance and regulatory during this period of time, because people aren't in the workforce. Now, some people will go ahead and they'll do it anyway, but you also need to add additional content. So if all you're doing is compliance and regulatory, nobody's going to be leveraging or utilizing that system until their due dates are due. So content replacement has to take place. So instead of leadership development at this point, more business skills, more opportunities. Here's a great time to get content that deals with like Office 365, which a lot of people have at home, Gmail, go through there. A lot of people are using Slack and Microsoft Teams. I can tell you the amount of content I've seen in systems that are offering where people are using Slack. It's like nearly zero. I talked to a variety of companies last week in different parts in the United States and in the world that were using Slack, and no one is providing any training, any content that deals with Slack. So you're going to have an audience that is working remote, is not tapped in and they're using Slack. And just because there's an app from the vendor that goes into Slack that they can take the content, which more and more systems are doing. One trend that I see, which is a negative trend, is they're not providing the content on the effective ways to use Slack. That content's available out there on the internet. And you shouldn't be using the how to use Slack coming from Slack, because that's, any L&D person knows that's not the most effective people. That's like sending somebody to YouTube and they go find Slack. And if that's what you're doing, then you're in the wrong field. You shouldn't be in L&D. You should be in something else, because you're the expert and should be that person of expert. So that's one piece. Again, the workforce tools, it can be a variety of things that are going in there. I'm not a fan of assessments. I don't think they're very effective when it comes to like taking a test on somebody, especially when it deals with e-learning. So workforce kind of goes back in. It gets back into guided learning. So here's how guided learning works. And this is where I am seeing vendors add more and more of this, is that the person goes in, the end user, and they go in and they're taking some type of content. Ideally, the vendor's done like a bookmarklet where it's capturing a variety of stuff off the web and it's being put into the system, which is happening. And then the person goes through or they're taking something on the system. And as they're doing it, sort of this window comes out. This is not Chatbot. This window comes out. And now the manager, the department head, the person running L&D, whoever can be asking certain questions. And it can be tied to these online workbooks or online materials. How would you do this? Now that's coming out of a material, right? So it's not them saying that and somebody responding like it's a chatbot. If it's a real person, that gets back to the other. But what it's going to be is guided learning is saying, how would you do this? Here's what you've just learned, and I'm giving you my online workbook, and you can download it, because look, in reality, people still download and still print. A lot of people still print out stuff and then we'll do that. But it goes through there, and now it's asking, right? It's guiding the learning. How can you achieve it? What have you just learned that you can apply to this? Or you do a scenario, and how would you apply to that? And so what guided learning really does is, one way is it changes the methodology behind you having to do an assessment, right? An assessment only means that you identify how much the person retained and memorized. Some assessments, they just go over, they can keep asking the same questions so they get the answers. So guided learning is really fantastic when it deals with skills, by the way. And so I do believe that you're going to see more guiding learning. Some of the vendors have little notepads that are there, and then the employee can leave a comment. Oh, I read this piece of content, or it was visual. I looked at this small video, and here's my feedback. You should go in and everybody should check out that session, part of that. And that's the power of guided learning. Guided learning is both the manager, again, you have that side of the house, and at the same time, it's the employee side of the house. So I believe that with guided learning, employees learn best from other employees. If you're working in, IT, then, I'm sorry, the system is Slack, S-L-A-C-K, excuse my accent, for that. So it's Slack. It's an extremely popular kind of tool. It does a variety of things. It's free, and then it charges options. Microsoft Teams, the reason that was created was to take on Slack. And so you can kind of go in the same places. And when people think like with the practice labs and they're typing into like Microsoft Teams should not replace your learning and development. I don't think it's not designed that way. I mean, it's sort of, you can make anything become a community of practice if you so be it. But again, the notes and the guided learning are very effective in terms of getting people out there to respond and go back and forth. And so, when it comes to compliance, there is, look, if you're in the UK, there's new financial regulatories that come out, you have to provide that content. So when I say compliance isn't important, what I'm saying is that if you're having, if you're having, you know, all you're having is compliance and people go in there, then they're not coming back and utilizing the system. People have to be engaged. If this is the greatest opportunity, whenever I hear people say, oh, nobody's using my system and these kinds of things, this is the greatest opportunity to get people to use your system. And so, yes, you can have GDPR content out there and make it so if it's a requirement, they make that requirement, but they have to go through in these, you know, to what's available to them, and then provide other certain topics. Again, there are so many topics out there that you know, you can find a content about how to be a more effective barista. That's out there. So you can always find a variety of different pieces of content takes place. And what's great about that is now you can go ahead and you can have that vendor talk to your learning system vendor and get the content moved over. You don't have to be the middle person that goes through this. They'll move it over and you can get them to do it free. So this gets back to the whole thing about practice labs. Some people call them virtual labs to go through there. Everything has to be tied back, which deals with this content replacement and going forward. Everything has to show value. You know, I always refer back to people and say, look, it's not about retention and comprehension. I mean, obviously those are key pieces. It's about synthesis. What can I take and how can I build upon that? And it has to show value to me as a, right? Adult learners always want to know what's in it for me. Right. So if you're having a way, you're like, look, I got to have bigger mass, then okay, put some gamification points in there so people can go ahead and, you know, they can take a variety of pieces of content and they get so many points. And then you kind of tie in. Even if your system doesn't have a gamification, it doesn't mean that you can't add points into just putting it in there. Maybe in the objectives by, you know, picking out a variety of different pieces. Because one of the things that deals with these whole kinds of trends is going back, and there is enough data to, you know, support this, is that a person is going to retain, comprehend, and synthesize more if they have an interest in it, right? So if I'm interested in learning this, it's going to be more effective to me, and I'll definitely have more engagement with it than if it isn't an interest to me. And this is where I see you have to have a table of contents in any of your content. And you have to allow people to bounce around and what's relevant to me. I use a great example with Microsoft Excel. If you went to an instructor session, Microsoft Excel, and you go to a beginning session, they're going to start on how to open a file. If I already know how to do that, and you have that same approach with your online learning, and you're saying to somebody, you have to go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, which I've seen, then you're going to have people that are just doing click. If I'm only interested in how to do macros, then why would I care about how to open a file? I couldn't care less. So I'm going to go back and I'm just going to open up and learn how to do macros. And I can already tell you, somebody's going to go back and over and over and over again and do that. And the same thing if you have managers. You put managers as a group, they can still do guided learning. Managers do not want to be stuck in the same group as employees. It's not effective. They don't like it because they don't want their employees knowing what they don't know. So managers and other division heads or whomever can be in a second group. You can still have a level of guided learning that takes place. And then the last trend here, please. Metrics. This is a trend I see across the board. More and more metrics are taking place in learning systems. The hot one right now are KPIs. Visualization. Visualization doesn't mean a histogram or a pie chart. So it means much more people are doing heat maps, they're looking over trends. I never understood the value of a metric with views. That doesn't tell me anything. Doesn't tell me whatsoever. All that means I glanced at it. Data provides the answers. And what some vendors are now doing is they're bringing in business intelligence tools and they're replacing the usual set of metrics. So the BI tool becomes the back end of the metrics. And, you know, I will recognize, you know, Fuse does a great job in this. They use a BI tool replacing their back end. It's got like some, you know, the possibility of 310 metrics. And, you know, Cross Knowledge does an also very good job with their back end of metrics. And there are plenty of vendors that have learning record stores, those LRSs, and there are plenty of them that don't activate it. And all these can provide extensive metrics. So you're going to see a huge uptick in metrics. More and more data than ever before is available. Next slide, please. So again, here's it is. It gets back to it. You're going to capture metrics. I'm always surprised the number of L&D people that have never done a skill gap analysis. That being said, any system can do skill gap. You can go through to it. It's all about, you should be focused on, and there's metrics that do ROI, by the way. It's all about impact of learning. And impact of learning is tied to your company's goals and objectives for that year. So if you have a company goal that you need to reduce safety accidents by 25%, well, right now during the pandemic, here's an opportunity to provide those kind of different pieces and still not make it as a compliance aspect, for that. But these are the trend that I see going through there. And so, again, remote work is becoming very popular content. Then have that content in there. Now, that's a direct correlation to your values for your company during this pandemic. Next slide, please. So here's all my kind of informations that goes through there. If you've not heard of Find an LMS, it's a search engine that I created, which enables it to be, it's all different types of learning systems, and you can compare them and see what feature sets they have, what for that. And then there's my other all kind of information. So thank you very much, and I'll switch back to Dave.
Craig, thank you so much. Really interesting. We've got one question from Renata that's come in, and they say, in my professional community of 11,000 people in Israel, people fear losing relevance and value in the long run. Can you give any thoughts to that and how people do stay relevant and with the relevant skills necessary to not lose that relevance going forward?
Sure. So what you need to be able to do is you have to provide obviously the content that ties to those skills, but the advantage is, and again, this deals with LXPs do a much better job at that as a whole, is they ask questions early on, and some learning systems do it too now, where they say, what do you want to learn? Well, what's your area of interest? What interest are you tied to? And then they can build upon that as their skills. And for people that lose their skills over time, this is, again, the advantage of reskill, which is where, look, if the system isn't providing it, you have to provide it as the L&D person or the person in HR or the person in training. And I mean, that's part of your job, right, is to do the ongoing continuous growth of personal and professional development. Number one, it's the most effective way the number one reason people leave companies is the lack of personal and professional development. That's a fact. So, you have to do some reskilling for them. Right. And it all gets back into, whether you have 11,000 or 200,000 employees or, 1,000 or 50 points or 50 employees, it has to tap into their level of interest on whether or not they're going to do that. So, if there are always going to be people that just want to be, the term is a worker bee. That's all they want to be. So you need to provide and recognize that kind of content that is pushed for them for the continuation. And people that lose those skills over time, you can find, there's this sort of big idea I see with virtual reality. Unless you have a VR headset at home, I don't care what virtual reality content you're existing. And what happens is on a mobile device or on a laptop, it comes out like a 3D. So if you're creating and you need a reskilling on how to do, people forget how to, do something with a car. And at least here in the States, those garages are open. But in other countries, if it isn't, then you have to find the content. Either you create it through a third-party authoring tool, or you outsource it to a custom boutique, small shop, whatever it might be. And you have them create this interactive piece where people have to click and do certain things, and it moves a hand around and still provides that content. And that's part of that reskilling opportunity, and that can replace an assessment. So what I'm describing here is, something called scenario-based learning. And the scenarios are real world, real life. So in your content, if you're creating it yourself, then you're putting in constantly real world situations that people have to apply and learn to, right? If you're dealing with people that are on the phone and they're having to deal with customer service, you can pretty much recognize that you're going to see in your consumer product, or your, let's say a software company, and people are, are going to be using your software now more and more. Hence, you probably might have some more and more kind of issues depending on what's happening with your audience. When people are unhappy, who do they call? You. They call the company and, or use the chat, whatever it might be. So you have to be cognizant of that fact, and then provide for those people a continuous ongoing base of skills, tie back to their interests. There's nothing that says you can't do a Survey Monkey or something, and you want to do it anonymous, by the way, and ask people going through, and you put a list down of skills and you send it to that person and you ask them those skills, and you'll start seeing a trend really quickly, a longitudinal trend in terms of what skills people are looking for. So if you want to make it and not say, look, Craig, I'm not going to do anonymous, I'm going to have straightforward, then go ahead and send it out to them and say that, you're wanting to create content or have things that are in there to be able to tap in for that. I admit it's much more challenging if you have blue collar and you have people doing pick and pack and whatnot, but you can still create that content. That's still doable. And you can still make it interactive and engaging, and for them to ongoing for that. Automation is changing a variety of things here. And this was kind of pre-pandemic where I was looking at automation. And of course, it's going to continue. So those folks are going to need to have those kind of skills that they can replace with what their current skills are to match that.
Fantastic, really interesting, Craig. Thank you. One from me, I was just kind of getting my head around when you were talking about the coaching earlier. Coaching's really been kind of the purview of and opened up to a very small percentage of an organization historically. It's been, the C-suite who potentially have been provided coaches, upper leadership. So with the trend of kind of coaching and the digitalization potentially of that, or technology facilitating it, do you see that that's just going to be possibly the same audience, but just with more frequency? Or do you see it actually being open to up to a much wider population within organizations?
I see it opening up to much more across the audience and not just the C-level. And because the C-level people, the advantage of digital coaches versus them, first and foremost being seen on site, is that the rates are different. Typically, when you're charging rates, if you're not having to go and travel and, go a physical, your rates are going to be lower. The second thing is I see digital coaching going across a wide variance of employees. The challenge is that too many people look at coaching and say, okay, that has to be based on leadership development. So whoever I see is an opportunity to move up, then that's so being it. I think that's still going to be the primary audience of what takes place, even though people are working from home. That said, there are going to be companies, and these are why coaching platforms work. I mean, I just saw one coaching platform, and the coaches had to have at least 6 years of managerial experience. They had to have at least 500 sessions of doing coaching, 500 hours rather. They had to have, all these kind of points before they could even be considered a coach. For that, they had to be certified by one of the coaching associations. Right? And you could go and right on the system, select the coach, and this coach can provide that. There is no reason that system couldn't be API'd, for example, or through there. But if you're having the coaches that are on your system, then it's going to be, I think, a smaller segment of across the board. I wish it was more. And a bigger segment, though, that's going to be identifying people who they perceive are going to be, again, into more of a leader.
Fantastic, thanks. So just one final one, because we are coming around to the top of the hour. Root has asked, in some organizations, the training department report to marketing or product departments. Do you see the challenges that they would be facing in that slightly different hierarchical reporting line to be the same as if, in a traditional sense, people are reporting into HR?
Well, actually, it's not really the traditional sense. As someone who's ran training in numerous companies, I never reported to HR.
Okay.
So a lot of times training is, it depends on the company, obviously, right? You can also you can run training and be in, working under IT, even though you're providing training for the entire, internal and external. If you work in an association, whatever your title happens to be, you're providing quote unquote training to either your members, if it's a professional, or trade, it's to your members that own businesses. And so I don't see, L&D is what typically slides under HR or is a separate department going through there, but many of them tie under HR. And I think that's where vendors get a little bit confused. But you're really going to have somebody running L&D that's doing B2B and customer training. Not against anything for them, but it's kind of rare. So I don't see it as long as the training is company-wide, then it could be under any department as far as I'm concerned. I mean, obviously the challenge is for, companies I see where they stick training under sales, because then their focus is just about training their sales force, and there isn't much more you can do about that. And that's sad, I think. But, for product and marketing going under, there's still going to be a focus. You find the content tied to them. But I think this is a great opportunity for people to tell their, politely, their executives or whoever they're reporting to, this is the best opportunity you're going to have to provide levels of training, whatever it might be, content-wise, to all employees, rather than just to a certain segment of your employee base. First of all, you're going to have higher retention, and people are going to stay at your company. And there's less opportunities when we get through the pandemic, right? Because of the marketplace, there's going to be less businesses across the board. So this is the time to, regardless of whether you're working under this department or that department, as long as that department head recognizes the value, then there shouldn't be an issue. If their value is only their employees under their, then, unfortunately, there's not a lot to do. Hopefully you can find somebody that buys into your vision and provide it to everybody and not just that department.
Superb. Thank you very much, Craig. This has been immensely interesting. Thank you very much, sir. Love the way that you're thinking, and some really interesting trends there. As you say, not all trends are positive. There may be some negative things for us to watch out for, especially in this tumultuous and ever-changing time. So thank you once again from myself and from Fuse. Here at Fuse, we do have another webinar coming up. There will be a link for you to be able to register for this in the chat. Imogen's just shared it now. This will be with Shane from IHG, talking around delivering their global onboarding and professional development to 5,500 leaders worldwide. So that's going to be on 31st of March at 3:30 p.m. GMT or 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. So do hope you can all join us for that. This has been recorded. We will be sharing the recording, and if there were any questions that apologies we didn't get to in the chat, we will be sending answers of those out via email. So thank you once again all for joining, and thank you, Craig, for your time today, the preparation insights.
Thank you.